Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report for our last edition of the year. With us today is a special guest, Norman Roule, who's actually been with the CIA for over 34 years. He's been a non-resident fellow for the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center, the cipher brief expert, and an advisor to two interesting organizations, Fight Extremism and UANI. Today we'll be discussing Iran's growing aggression, its alliances, and the overarching theme is what is going to happen if the Vienna talks fail, and what that is going to look like in terms of Iran's policies and its relationships. For those who don't know me, my name is Irina Tsukerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Mr. Roule, before we launch the discussion on the substance of these points, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your current work, and the organizations you're involved in, just to give our audience a brief idea.
Well, good evening, Ms. Zuckerman, and thank you for having me tonight. As you stated, I spent more than 34 and a half years working in the U.S. intelligence community on a variety of Middle Eastern topics with a focus on Iran. In fact, for the last 10 years of that career, I was a lead in the U.S. government on intelligence issues for Iran and served as the national intelligence manager for Iran for many years. Since my retirement, I've worked as a consultant on regional security, political, energy, and economic issues.
So your background, your familiarity with Iran, with both the regime and its structure and its involvement of the population is quite extensive. We've been hearing a lot about Iran, what it will and will not do in the course of the extensive attempt to engage with it on the return to the JCPOA under the Biden administration. So far, however, we are entering the 8th round of the Vienna talks, and there seems to be no clear end in sight. So what is the end game for Iran from these talks, and do you think, based on what you've been seeing and hearing from these negotiations, that it has achieved any of what it wanted?
That's a great question. Well, to begin, let me provide a little bit of history. It is commonly thought that the United States and Iran have great difficulty talking to each other or with each other. That's generally untrue, or at least until recently it's been untrue. Every presidential administration since the Carter administration has attempted to engage Iran in diplomacy in an effort to see if there's some sort of common ground could be discovered by which we could resolve our difficulties without leading to conflict. In every one of those instances, and I participated in or monitored many of those instances, Iran rebuffed those efforts. It has always been Iran that has denied an opportunity for diplomatic engagement unless Iran felt it was achieving such significant vantage points from this engagement, such as in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that it would engage in a limited discussion. For the nuclear talks right now, I think it's important that we underscore Iran isn't necessarily interested in curtailing its nuclear program. The nuclear deal itself was controversial in Iran itself. It wasn't controversial because hardliners opposed it per se. Indeed, hardliners, in essence, won through the deal. They obtained sanctions relief, consistent funding for all of their operations, and an ability to plan forward in the region, knowing that the international community would not be able to impose new sanctions because of what it's doing in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, or Lebanon. However, the Supreme Leader and others were concerned that although nuclear sanctions were lifted, that Iran's other behaviors might just result in the same set of sanctions. And indeed, engagement with the West in general would invite cultural contagions that could undermine the revolution. These two concerns came together when businesses refused to deal with Iran because of its other activities and the unrest that took place in Iran. So now into these negotiations itself, Iran has several goals. The first is it wants to ensure that the international community directly engages one of the bloodiest regimes in Iran's history, led by Ibrahim Raisi and a multitude of heavily sanctioned individuals. It has achieved this goal. Secondly, it's attempted to use the negotiations to ensure that no international coalition can be formed against it. It wishes to break Russia and China, Europe and the Gulf away from each other. And in general, this policy at present is achieved that. Last, it's attempting to use the negotiations to raise the level of its nuclear program so that it has a list of a new normal of activities against it, which can push back against requests for other concessions and leave this negotiations with a more advanced program than it originally started.
Do you think these actors, the China, Russia, as well as European participants and the United States, do you think they understand the game that Iran is playing and to what extent?
I believe Russia and China are deeply aware of Iran's strategy, and in large part, they support it. We need to recall that for Russia and China, their goal in the Middle East is to keep the United States engaged to some extent, but not so greatly engaged that it upsets an international trade or energy order from which they benefit. So friction between the United States and the region is a good thing from the direction of Moscow or Beijing. Secondly, neither Moscow nor Beijing have a real problem with what Iran is doing in the region. You don't hear of Russia or China criticizing Iran in any international fora. Indeed, Russia and China have blocked any action against Iran at the United Nations Security Council for more than a decade. That's an astounding fact in and of itself. Last, the Russians and the Chinese each have economic interest and some military interest in Iran that would be subsumed or subordinated to Western technology or Western vendors if a deal were actually to occur. So all in all, for Russia and China, the current state of events is not entirely negative.
You make a very interesting point that I would like to explore a little bit in more detail in a bit when we get to discussing China's and Iran's relationship. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to ask something about these Vienna talks seems to be a little bit different from the previous rounds. For the first time, the United States, Jake Sullivan just visited Israel, and various other participants are bringing up the idea of the talks potentially failing, and they're discussing a scenario where supposedly everyone only has weeks left before announcing and declaring failure, and therefore afterwards other action is going to be taken. And there's been talks about Israeli drills and U.S.-Israeli joint drills and so forth. What do you make of these comments? Do these comments speak to the seriousness of a tougher track against Iran, or the opposite? Or is it just another attempt to get Iran motivated to actually be constructive at the table?
I think it's a bit of each. We need to be clear that diplomacy should be the preferred route for the United States and the international community in dealing with Iran. No one wants to see a conflict in the Middle East, which would cost lives of Iranians, Americans, Europeans, regional actors. We wish to avoid this conflict by any means. This said, it has been clear for more than a year that Iran has not been serious about returning to the deal. There have been some who have played the theme that a difference in Iranian administrations has signaled a change in Iran's behavior. That is not supported by the facts. Iran's president and its foreign minister played little role in the security decision-making of its country They're more involved in the style and how that decision is executed. The supreme leader, who has been a constant factor of Iran decision-making since 1989 and since the nuclear deal of 2005, has been deeply dissatisfied with the deal and has made this known in a number of public statements. What you're watching now is, I think, an unsurprising new phase in the talks, where Iran's lack of cooperation, its lack of seriousness, its delaying of the talks, its refusal to meet directly with the United States, it's all wearing thin. And Iran's nuclear program has now reached a level that exceeds where it began under the Trump administration, under the original nuclear deal. And although many will blame the Trump administration for withdrawing from the deal, it is factually correct to say that most of these improvements occurred during the last year, indeed, while diplomacy was open. The administration is now saying that the level of Iran's activity is reaching the point where you're going to need a new form of deal completely. The old deal just won't fit, and we're running out of time on this. I think for Israel, it's a different situation. Iran routinely speaks of the extermination of the state of Israel. It routinely attacks Israel and its multinational population, which includes thousands of Americans. And the Israelis, frankly, can't afford to take the chance or the risk of the rest of the international community. I'd like to throw out a little bit of history. A former Iranian president, Rafsanjani, reportedly stated, and this has been in the press, that whereas Iran could take a nuclear attack and survive, the Jewish people of the world would be pretty much annihilated with a single nuclear weapon in Israel. This has been a repeated motif in Iranian decision-making and rhetoric for years. Indeed, death to Israel is written on some of their missiles. So Israel must take the situation more seriously. I'll close with one more comment. The United States and Israel have exceptionally close security, intelligence, and diplomatic relations. Some of the rhetoric and politics may show disagreement, but at a working level, the relationships are quite close. And what this means is that a factual understanding of the situation is going to be known and shared by the United States and Israel. What to do about that, however, that's where the difference lays between Tel Aviv and Washington.
It seems that Israel has made it quite clear that they're not going to wait for Iran to reach a critical point before taking whatever action needs to be taken to disrupt its activities. The Biden administration publicly communicated that they will not allow that to be the case, but again, more recently, they claimed that the countries have come together on a timeline for taking other actions if these current talks don't pan out. What does failure actually look like in reality? Is there a clear picture of what this joint cooperation may look like, or are we still at a very nebulous guessing stage as to what action could be taken jointly by Israel and the US if Iran walks away from the table, or the other negotiators walk away from the table, or they just essentially don't come to any understanding?
So if this were a movie, the decisions would be relatively clear-cut. There would be intelligence or an action by Iran or a fast meeting in Washington or Tel Aviv that would make these decisions very quickly. That's not how it works in reality. I've worked with multiple White House administrations, and I have worked with Israeli officials for almost 2 decades, to include prime ministers. The nature of Iran's decision-making itself may not be so precise and so distinct as to lead to a single conclusion. And because people wish to avoid a conflict at all costs, and there's always a concern that a limited military action would lead to a broader regional conflict that would threaten the people of Israel and the region, as well as the United States and the international global market and energy system, that we want to avoid that with alternative measures such as diplomacy, back channel messages, front channel messages, messages by other partners, more trade sanctions or embargoes. That conversation, the list of choices that you make in response to the limited and sometimes vague data, is really how this is likely to play out. So I would caution your viewers from expecting that there will be it's very unlikely, it's conceivable, but it's very unlikely there will be a single event or action that will cause one side to say, we've no choice but to march forward right now, because Iran is unlikely to act that way within its own bureaucracy.
In other words, no one right now has a clear idea of what's actually going to happen a few weeks from now, especially since Iran quite possibly could, at the end of the day, throw some very small bone just to keep this going for whatever period of time it needs to do whatever it needs to do. That seems to be rather disconcerting.
That is the likely outcome.
So, in the meantime, what I'm hearing from the administration is that there are some officials floating the idea of an interim agreement that would include the lifting of some additional sanctions. How realistic is that scenario? What would it depend on, and what would that look like?
It's not very realistic, largely because Iran has rejected this on a number of occasions. We have to keep in mind that Iran is not looking for the lifting of sanctions on nuclear issues. Iran is looking to eradicate the use of sanctions as a tool of pressure in response to any of its actions in terrorism, missiles, detention of hostages. Iran is in essence trying to erase all sanctions. So for Iran to achieve its strategic goals, it's not looking for just the capacity to sell a little more oil. Now, it may be willing to take this if it believes that within the West, or the P5, there is sufficient weakness so that in a couple of months or a few months, it might be able to achieve its ultimate success. But we need to keep in mind that Iran is a revisionist actor. It's trying to change the world order in its near abroad, just as Russia attempts to do this in Eastern Europe and China in the South Pacific. So Iran is in essence trying to eradicate how the world works around it. So it's not really interested in a less for less deal. This said, there will be those in Washington and certainly in Europe who will view a less for less deal, a sort of partial. Iran freezes its current operations in exchange for some sanctions relief as a way of buying time for more diplomacy. In theory, that sounds quite logical and will probably be explored aggressively by diplomats on all sides. But I would caution that it also implies that there might be a change in circumstances that could be expected. And there's no evidence that Iran is willing to change its paradigm of how it either perceives negotiations or is responding to the lack of coercive diplomacy that is being employed to date.
So far, I have not heard any concrete discussions about reimposition of any specific sanctions. I may be wrong, that may very well be considered, but I have not heard anything about it. And in the meantime, what I am seeing from various sources, public sources, there's indication that Iran's proxies in the region are picking up aggression against US targets. And there seems to be an indication that while these talks are going on, Iran's aggression in the Middle East is actually finding a second breath. Not that it fully went away at any point, but particularly with the US targets, it's increasing and may increase even more as time goes on. What exactly is Iran trying to achieve with this sort of unconstructive activity while the talks are ongoing, and what are its proxies getting out of these arrangements, considering that it's basically sabotaging the talks?
So let me unpack a number of the points that you mentioned in your interesting question. First, the Biden administration would say, and accurately so, that it has not lifted any of the significant sanctions imposed by the Trump administration or the Obama or Bush administration prior to that. There have been reports that the Biden administration has allowed the International Monetary Fund to provide Iran with money that I do not believe it needs, but nonetheless provided money to assist Iran to fight COVID. And since Iran has money to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorists, it should have money to pay for its own COVID requirements. There has also been a spike in Chinese oil purchases from Iran, and it is factually correct to say that that spike began immediately after the election of President Biden, indeed going back to last November, and particularly since the Biden administration came on. That may well be a China story as much as an Iran story, that China is just not willing to abide by sanctions. Vice America has allowed it to do so, but it is correct to say that. You noted at the end, what I think is a fascinating and too seldom reported issue, and that is Iran's attacks upon the region. So when Iran is striking the region, Iran is in essence using proxies to undertake actions that it itself cannot do. So under international law, if Iran were to fire a missile, for example, against a country, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, wherever, they could fire back to defend themselves. But if Iran is providing support to missiles, weapons, terrorism, to proxies, then under international law, these countries are only able to strike the proxies. So Iran is in essence fighting to the last militant or last extremist in the region. If you look at the statistics of ballistic missile attacks, drone attacks, armed drone attacks, explosive boat attacks, mine attacks, there is no question that the region has seen an unprecedented spike since January of 2021. Now, what is most important there is, and I think is sometimes lost, these missiles are aimed at Saudi men, women, and children. These are civilian targets that are routinely focused upon by the Houthis with Iranian aid, Lebanese Hezbollah aid, Iraqi Hezbollah aid, and perhaps some other assistance as well. But it should also be noted that there are 10 million foreigners in Saudi Arabia. And just as Saudi lives are important, their lives are equally important. So we recently had a very strange situation where the US Senate had 30 senators who opposed providing Saudi Arabia with air-to-air munitions. These are munitions which cannot hurt civilians on the ground. They're only used to shoot down drones and missiles. 30 US senators opposed providing that support to the Saudis. And I think an important question needs to be asked. What responsibility do those senators have to the thousands of Americans, about 80,000 Americans who live in Saudi Arabia, and the hundreds of billions of dollars of American investment that should be protected, along with Saudi women and children and the many nationals of other countries as well? So I think it was a disappointing vote, but this spike has continued. I would close by saying that the Saudi air defense forces, if you look at just the sheer facts, they're the most experienced and unfortunately the most successful air defense force on the planet today. No country has sustained such a lengthy, intense, and multi-tooled attack of drones, land attack cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles as Saudi Arabia in decades, perhaps not since the Second World War.
Interesting to note, now that you mentioned that the Saudi Air Forces, is that recently the Arab coalition led by Saudi Arabia in Yemen has been leading a very successful air campaign against Houthi installations in various cities, including Sana'a, where the Houthi fighters, the Iran-backed militia, have managed to turn various sites, including the airport, into warehouses and installations that they used to attack Saudi Arabia. So far this year alone, reportedly 30,000 Houthi fighters died in these air campaigns, and yet these fighters continue their attacks, they retreat, they come back, and there seems to be no end in sight to these campaigns. But by now, the US has issued countless statements condemning Houthi aggression against civilians, use of civilian installations for military attacks, and so forth. And yet, what I am hearing from what you just said is that nevertheless, 30 senators, that's 30% of the US Senate, literally, still appears to believe that Saudi Arabia should not have means for self-defense, still does not seem fully committed to supporting the idea that Iran's role in Yemen is extremely dangerous, still does not seem to understand that the same militants fighting with the Saudis are threatening international maritime trade in the region, and they don't seem to understand why Yemen is so important to Iran to begin with. They don't understand Iran's role there, why Iran is backing the Houthi fighters, and to what extent that relationship is dangerous to the outside world. So I was hoping that since they don't understand, you could possibly give some insight on this issue.
Well, I think the U.S. Senate has a number of resources to better understand the issue, but perhaps I can explain how I understand it based upon my relatively regular discussions with senior officials abroad and in the United States, and from years of following this. So first, we should note that Saudi Arabia and the other members of the coalition have pursued a diplomatic track with the Houthis for years. The Houthis have rejected the diplomacy. They have accepted diplomacy more readily when they're under military pressure. But if they feel that the West or the international community has abandoned the Arab coalition and the Saudis, then they frankly reject diplomacy. The Saudis have spoken with the Houthis routinely via Oman and the United Nations for years, and a very generous peace deal has been on the table for several years. The Houthis have rejected this. When pressed, they will either ask for more, and more means their domination of Yemen, or their belief that they will receive this fine package in the end, but in the meantime, they will benefit by listening to Iran and extending this conflict for as long as possible. Now, the issue of Yemen itself has become unfortunately, particularly for the Yemeni people, a highly partisan issue in the United States. It's not a week goes by when generally Iranian propagandists or partisan actors will show pictures of starving Yemeni children. This is generally propaganda. There are Yemenis who are facing dire food shortages. Much of this is caused by Houthi taxes on food. The United Nations has not declared that the Saudis are blocking food or fuel into the country. It's also a fact that the United Nations would agree, and that we have tons of material to prove that Iran is using Hodeidah port and other ports to import weapons, which, to be clear, they're firing on civilians, not only in Yemen, but in Saudi Arabia and other places where there are, again, from the Washington perspective, Americans, as well as Saudi women and children, men, women, and children. So there is a profound reason for Saudi Arabia to defend itself. And I think we ought to ask ourselves as Americans, if this were happening on our border, would we do this differently? So now you raised what I think is a really important question of why Iran is interested in this conflict. Well, there are several reasons. First, it allows them to bleed Saudi Arabia indirectly. It allows them to embarrass the international community because we're not pushing back. It allows the partisan fight to occur in the United States, where in essence, Iran conducts a strike into Saudi Arabia, silence from much of Americans' politics. But if the Saudis were to strike in Sana'a, you will have criticism from some members of the American Congress. It's deeply unfair, and it's a great tool for Iran. But why does Iran want Yemen? Yemen is in a hugely strategic position. So I would invite your viewers to just pull out a map of the world. When you're thinking about global trade, what you want to understand are the choke points by which trade can be cut off. Think of that ship that was the Evergreen that was stuck in the Suez and shut down so much of the world's traffic. Well, there are about 8 choke points in the world. 3 of them are around Yemen. You have the Strait of Hormuz at the Gulf. You have the Bab el Mandab, the Gate of Tears, and then north you have the Suez Canal. If you're Iran and you control Yemen, you are able to control 3 of the world's 8 global choke points for international trade. Now, I need to tell you, what does that mean? That means Iran is able to control at least 40%, perhaps more than 45% of all the oil floating in the world every day. It's able to control at least 12, maybe 15% of global trade, more than 10% of world rice. It's able to impact the economies of Southern Europe, the Red Sea Basin, as well as the Arabian Peninsula, and directly American consumers. So for those who saw the impact of one ship stuck in the Suez Canal, imagine what would happen if weeks on end, no ships were able to enter the entire Red Sea. That would have an impact on energy prices in the United States, on unemployment, as well as on supply chains throughout the world.
That is indeed quite a horrific scenario, but one that, for whatever reason, the international community is not only not considering, but is actively facilitating. We have heard the UN providing its vehicles to use for Houthis for operations, warehouses for storage of weapons. We have heard that UN has granted Houthis direct humanitarian assistance, despite the fact that it's clear that a lot of this assistance is used to subsidize, again, aggression and operations. And of course, we are seeing that the administration's policy, despite repetitive condemnations of all of this activity, has not been to relegate the Houthis back to the foreign terrorist organizations list, even though the situation is far more than about humanitarian aid. It's about the fact that there's an open path to disrupt the entire region. The Houthis are a danger not only to Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but potentially to UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. There is more to the story, however, which is that we've been hearing from other actors who are looking to take U.S. position in the Middle East, as U.S. is increasingly withdrawing its troops and resources, namely China. China has repeatedly stated that it seeks to create a balance of power to stabilize the Middle East. That we have heard from a former Israeli intelligence director, Chaim Halevi, that it believes at this point China is the only country capable of achieving that goal. But is it actually the case? Is China really interested in stabilization? We have seen that China has done energy and other deals with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. We have seen that China is willing to engage with both countries and perhaps even push for direct diplomatic engagement. But does that really amount to stabilization? Because while China is certainly talking the talk, it has also provided the Houthis with drones that had been used to attack Saudi Arabia. And while China is also building military base in UAE and engaging in ballistic missile technology transfer with Saudi Arabia, it's at the same time empowering Iran through energy deals and these drone technology transfers that benefit the Houthis and end up being used in various operations. So what's the real story here? Well, what is China's real agenda? Is it really a stabilizing actor?
So I think I'd like to begin where you began at the United Nations. I'm not aware of any reports where the United Nations has directly provided military support to the Houthis, but I am aware of reports where the Houthis have exploited international aid for their own military benefit and those of their actors. China and Russia have repeatedly blocked any action against the Houthis at the United Nations. There have been multiple seizures of weapons from Iran going to the Houthis and investigations of Houthi activities against civilians that Russia and China have turned into lengthy, no end investigations that are eventually shelved if they're ever completed. I'm unaware of an international official that doesn't actually have a very clear position and a picture of what the Houthis are up to, but they're stuck. Their job is to try to develop negotiations, and their job is to facilitate humanitarian aid in an area where the Houthis control. So it tends to constrain what they say, and Russia and China exploit this. So what is China looking for in the region? Again, let's pull out that map for your viewers. If you look at how China has arrayed its strategic partners in the region, it has declared 5 or 6 countries its most important partners. So again, keeping that map in mind, you have Iran, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, you have Egypt, and you have Algeria. Now that's pretty much a line of its trade to Europe. And it gives China a capacity to manage the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, a variety of different locales. This is China's main goal. Whereas the United States is a geostrategic and geopolitical actor, China is a geoeconomic or geocommercial actor. What that means is we don't seek to control oil in the Gulf. We seek to ensure equal access to oil in the Gulf. You don't see any American firms that deny oil in the Gulf for shipping to anyone else. That's just not what we have historically done. China, on the other hand, wants to control these resources for its own economy. It's fairly open about this, but it has no desire to become that security presence that the United States has provided over the years. So in this case, China and Russia, they want the best of both worlds. They would like the United States to be criticized for its actions in the region, to fight amongst itself over its regional role, but nonetheless to remain there in sufficient place that it provides security so that they can conduct their commercial and economic activities. That's really what they're looking for. China has maintained a small military base in Djibouti. Again, look at that map. That's at the base of the Red Sea. Russia has talked about placing a small logistics naval base in the Sudan that would be capable of supporting up to 4 nuclear-powered submarines, thus extending their range and the amount of time they can spend in the Indian Ocean and other waters. This mapped picture is very important for Russia, to understanding Russia and China in the region. But China's goal with Iran at the same time is to both defend it at the United Nations and to exploit it as much as possible commercially. If you look at that map again, there's a port called Chabahar. Now, Chabahar is a port that is under development. The Chinese wish to build a nuclear power plant there, an industrial facility, and a rail line that would, in essence, go north. Ideally for China, their goal would be to offload freight in the East China Sea and be able to move it by rail across Asia to Chabahar eventually to the Arabian Sea. That requires an economic and diplomatic engagement with Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, but China is doing this. So I think when you look at where China is going in the region, it's all about commerce, economics, but it's not about providing any stability for the region.
So it's very obvious that China is more than willing to play all sides because from its perspective, whether it's selling drones to the Houthis or building a base in the UAE or engaging in ballistic missile technology transfer with the Saudis, all of it is just commercial activity with no particular ideological role. But from the perspective of those countries, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, they seem to think that by engaging in China, they are getting some sort of a bulwark against Iran's aggression. Are they wrong?
That is correct. In theory, the idea would be by having a relationship with China, they would gain Chinese support to the United Nations, or at the very least, China would approach Iran and prevent Iran from attacking commercial interests in which China itself has invested. There's also the potential, but again, for the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, China is a vast market and a purchaser of oil. I think at some point, China will also be seen as a potential source of weaponry, perhaps missiles, as was in the case of Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. If we look down the line, China is more than willing to sell weapons, more than willing to sell any of its goods. It's just unwilling to play a role in taking sides in the region.
Do you believe that Iran can exploit these engagements, China's engagement with the Arab states, to promote its own agenda indirectly?
Yes, and indeed for Iran, it's attempted to do this. Shortly after the nuclear deal was signed, President Xi Jinping visited first Saudi Arabia to sign a major economic deal, and then Iran, where he signed a preliminary deal, which was recently fleshed out. But this deal is it's vast. It's vast beyond reality. It's aspirational. It's ambitious to the point of an illusion. It covers pretty much every area of Iran's economy. For China and Iran, their economic relationship has been rocky, but it has been a relationship each has relied upon. For example, China and Iran both have problems with the United States. During the Iran-Iraq War, China provided Iran with weapons. China is also a good purchaser of Iranian oil, as we've seen in particular since November of 2022. But China has also flooded Iran with cheap goods, and many Iranian businesses have suffered because China has undercut Iran's internal economy. And Iran is not seeking Chinese technology, which is generally inferior to Western technology or a copy of Western technology, save in some military fields. So each side knows the other is using it, but they don't have many other options at present.
So, to the extent that China is also engaging with the Arab states that have a somewhat illusory idea of its role in the region, can Iran use this misunderstanding to kind of piggyback of China's presence and latch on and open and have doors open for it elsewhere, where it's currently not particularly welcome, or where it has a hard time gaining entry?
I think the best Iran can get out of China, it's getting right now. Diplomatic support of the UN, trade support busting American and international sanctions, strong support in the nuclear talks. Of all the P5+1 actors who have stood up in defense of Iran and the Iran deal, China has actually been the loudest. And this has unsettled many who have expected China to play a quieter role, usually taking the back seat to Moscow. This is not happening at present. I'm not sure that China is interested in giving Iran anymore because it doesn't really need to enjoy the benefits it seeks from Tehran itself at present.
A lot of factors seem to depend on what Iran manages to get out of its European counterparts in the near future, and some of the Europeans in particular seem more than willing to overlook its not only its aggression in the Middle East, but even its nuclear activity. It's the US that seems to be the most disappointed with the current course of action, even despite the administration's single-minded focus on that particular foreign policy. But while all of that is going on, Iran itself seems to be pursuing multiple agendas. Elsewhere, we are seeing that it's not waiting for handouts from the Biden administration. It's continuing to engage in smuggling activities. We've been hearing a lot lately from Yoni in particular about the ships, the tracking of the ships that go back and forth to Venezuela. what can we glean from that information? Why is that important, and why has there been so little in the news about it in general?
United Against Nuclear Iran, or UANI, does superb work following Iran's oil sales around the world. So, in essence, what we've got is probably the best picture provided by UANI of Iran's relationships with another actor that is a pariah and a rogue state. Iran and Venezuela have deep relations. They go back to the origination of OPEC in 1960, but really under Hugo Chavez from 2001 until 2013. Chavez saw in Iran, and Iran saw in Chavez, a partner against the United States, a source of sanctions busting, a protection or a voice in the United Nations, a friend of the United Nations, and a friend in the region. So Iran uses its Latin and South American partners to build a regional approach. If you look at Iran's needs from South America in general, Venezuela is actually it's not its most important partner. That partner is generally Brazil, from whom Iran receives a large portion, perhaps as much as half of its corn, soybean, and other products, sometimes beef. And in return, it sends us a modest amount of glassware, fertilizer, some small items. It's a significant balance. But Iran has used its relationships with Venezuela and with Brazil under a previous president to build connections into Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and indeed you saw under the Ahmadinejad era, and indeed under to a lesser extent under the Rouhani era, but now promised under the Rais era, frequent visits. Nicolas Maduro has just promised to visit Iran, and this is again a coalition of rogue states.
In the meantime, we are also seeing that China has invested quite heavily economically in many of these very same countries. Do you think there appears to be some sort of a symbiotic relationship in that regard, with China investing into infrastructure and dragging these countries into debt traps, and Iran just engaging in trade, engaging some level of political and ideological support? How does it
I
look
think you
like?
have two issues here. The first is that it is true China has engaged in multiple predatory deals that have hostaged multiple countries' economies to Chinese bad loans. That's playing out throughout the world, from Sri Lanka to Africa to throughout the world. At the same time, Iran doesn't have that much of a capacity to invest. It generally tends to send oil in exchange for gold or some products. So the oil that Iran has sent to Venezuela, for example, is a type of oil that Venezuela could use to dilute its own oil to make it more saleable and more productive. So Venezuela's just terrible oil industry, which is in terrible shape, has been able to improve its production slightly because it's sent it's received this oil from Iran. But when it comes to trade deals, they're a disaster. Iran and Venezuela signed over 300 different trade deals. They all came to nothing. And likewise in Africa, where I think hundreds of trade deals were conducted as well. And again, the businesses failed. There were car companies that collapsed after selling very few cars, et cetera, et cetera.
In recent, couple of years, we've been hearing a lot more about Iran's activities in Africa than about its activities in Latin America, for what they're worth. We've been hearing about, more recently, Iran's sale of drones to the Ethiopian government, along with Turkey and some others, and the return of Hezbollah to more active positioning in Africa. What is Iran looking for in Africa, and how is that different from its relationships in Latin America and its agenda there? Or is there a difference?
In many ways, the goals are identical. Iran is looking for trade partners to bust sanctions. And in Iran's trade with all of Africa is about the same as all its trade for Latin and South America. We're talking about $700 million a year of exports, very small amount for a continent-size market. Second, it looks for a place where it can gain diplomatic friends, opponents of the United States, opponents of the West. That's more difficult in Africa traditionally, but it's been easier in Latin America. It's looking to gain proxies and to find terrorists. And fairly frequently, you see information of terrorists working for Iran in Kenya, Somalia, Senegal, a variety of places, Nigeria, who have been arrested, just as you see in the tri-border area in Iran, where in Latin America, where Lebanese Hezbollah has been so impactful. And last, I think you're looking at a market for Iranian weapons. Iran has attempted to sell its weapons abroad not recently in Ethiopia with its drones, but also in other countries in Africa and South and Latin America over the years. And the United States and its partners have blocked this successfully. But Iran's goals are similar in all of these areas.
So we actually seen a kind of triangle emerge with the Hezbollah smuggling operations, whether it's drugs, precious metals, and diamonds, and so forth, between Africa, Latin America, Middle East. We are seeing also mining operations in both Africa and Latin America. Is there any more of a kind of direct coordination other than through proxies? Essentially, are we seeing at a potential Iranian influence on a state level that could indicate a creation of a political bloc between African and certain Latin American states where there's a heavy Hezbollah influence?
Iran would certainly like to see this, but I think Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah work differently. By any international measure, and I would suggest your viewers look at Transparency International, Iran's corruption level is among the worst in the planet. I think it's about 140 out of 176 states for being among the most corrupt countries in the world. The Lebanese Hezbollah tends to fund itself in a variety of ways, some of which is associated with criminal activity in Africa and South America. Iran doesn't necessarily need that same type of funding because it diverts resources from its national budget, which is sustained on oil sales and non-hydrocarbon revenue sources. So because they have different money needs, they work differently, but in the end, they're each trying to build friends that support Iran's goals, which are generally involve terrorism, generally involve hostility against a variety of countries. And I should say there's an interesting comparison, because when you look at other actors in the region, ranging from the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, for example, you see development projects in Africa, you see commercial projects, you see projects that are meant to maybe more engaged in soft power of people-to-people deals. You just don't see this from Iran or its proxies. There, it's corruption, it's violence, and it leads to death.
Well, from what I understand, Iran and its proxies do engage in some level of soft power, but it's aimed at ideological recruitment, not so much general improvement of the economies, so forth, which is interesting. I guess maybe it's cheaper and does not really require same level of investment. But it does, bringing back to Iran and Ethiopia, this raises a question of how Iran chooses its allies to begin with, because Ethiopia is currently in a state of civil war with multiple parties. At one point, it looked very much like the government might fall. Why did Iran choose to side with the federal government, and what does it gain out of supplying it with drones?
So there are two issues here. First, you mentioned correctly and wisely Iran's use of soft power. Throughout South America and Africa. Iran has a number of facilities that are meant to propagate its version of Shia Islam, and it uses these facilities to both spread propaganda and to bring people to Iran for ideological training and recruitment by the Quds Force, their terrorist arm of their elite military, the Revolutionary Guard. Regarding Ethiopia, I think you need to take a step back and ask, how does Iran work abroad? For Iran to work abroad, it needs 4 characteristics, and you see all 4 in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. First, it needs a failed state or state in a state of civilian collapse, where security forces need Iran's help to stay alive. Second, it needs an open logistics pipeline. The bigger that pipeline, the more the support. The third thing it needs is a lack of an external actor willing to block it or push it out. The United States, the international community. And the fourth, it prefers to have a Shia community which is beleaguered, or it can speak about for ideological purposes as something it needs to protect. Now, Ethiopia does not have that Shia community, but it does have all the other elements. It is a failing state. It has a logistics pipeline to Iran where Iran can send things in, and it doesn't have a country willing to keep Iran's material out. So for this reason, Iran is just exploiting the Ethiopian condition to make money and to build political goodwill with the Ethiopian government, along with China.
But does it believe that this current government will stay in power? Given that there are a number of competing factions that are challenging the federal authorities in Ethiopia.
That is true, but I'm not sure Iran cares. If the government stays in power, it's got a friend, it's made money, it's sold weapons, it's got military to military connections in an unconventional way. If the government doesn't stay in power, Iran didn't have a lot invested in the locale in the first place, and it might be able to work with the successor government as well. Versus China, which has about $6 billion of investments in Ethiopia, and it is maintaining its presence there to protect those investments so that a successor government doesn't come in and try to rewrite the commercial deals which tend to favor Beijing.
So that is interesting. China is far more invested into the Abiy government than Iran is, and Iran sort of just seems to be looking for a partner and almost doesn't care who that is as long as they fit.
That's very correct. And a wide array of partners. You've got Hamas, elements of the Taliban, Zaidi Houthis, Shia from Lebanese Hezbollah. Iran is fairly indiscriminate as to who it takes on as a proxy.
In fact, even the formerly completely leftist Polisario in North Africa, it seems to be a potential partner for Iran, and frankly, even Al Qaeda. Very little is said about Iran's relationship with Al Qaeda, the cover that Iran has given to the leaders, and what it has tried to get out of them. But I think this is a rich topic for discussion in itself. Iran's willingness and flexibility in choosing its partners, despite seemingly vast the ideological differences, even competing agendas and competing sometimes for the same recruits and for the same resources. It does not stop Iran from cooperating with some of these actors. And the question is, how does it manage to appeal to so many different...
Iran is, in essence, providing support, haven, funding, sometimes training to actors who have no other avenue from which to obtain these important resources. When Al Qaeda's leadership council, the Shura Council, sought refuge in Iran, they didn't do that out of just luck. They did that because they were assured of haven in that country. And even when they were loosely detained by the Iranian government, they were not sent back to their home countries where they could have provided tremendous information on Al-Qaeda operations around the world. When the first strikes occurred upon Al-Qaeda in 2001, several thousand Al-Qaeda operatives transited Iran to their home countries. Iran detained many of them, if not most of them. Iran let most of them go, and actually let all of them go. And the point is that had it not done so, it would have transformed the war on terror. Finally, I would suggest that your viewers look at the annual threat assessment issued by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which every year states that there is an operational Al-Qaeda cell operating in Iran with the knowledge of the Iranian government. Now, there is no country on earth that has been tolerated to maintain a working relationship with Al-Qaeda other than Iran. And I think future historians will look at the period of the war on terror as a somewhat confused issue because we have allowed this to happen.
I would add that there is a natural comparison and connection to be made with Afghanistan, where one of the elements of the deal, of the supposed peace deal between the US and Taliban, was that they would not allow Al-Qaeda to be present on the ground. As we are already seeing, Al-Qaeda has been returning there from various places, including Iran. So we are seeing that there is sort of a willingness to turn a blind eye to support for outright terrorism, including terrorist groups who have attacked US on its own soil, when it comes to broader political agendas. And I'm not really sure what kind of message that's sending to Iran and other actors, but it can't be anything that would help in Vienna or in any other effort to gain leverage.
In essence, Iran has been able to use Al-Qaeda for two purposes. First, by assisting Al-Qaeda and providing haven and some support, it buys some goodwill from Al-Qaeda. Don't strike us, we're helping you, strike others. But at the same time, it's able to have a card to play against the West. We can make things worse for you with Al-Qaeda if you pressure us. So I think one of the issues that you see happening regarding the nuclear deal is, unfortunately, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has become, in many cases, a substitute for a broader Iran policy. You hear almost nothing about Iran's activities in Syria, where it involves Afghan militias, Pakistani militias, Lebanese Hezbollah, and is undertaking a war against the Syrian people that involves barrel bombs and the Syrian government use of chemical weapons on hundreds of occasions. You hear nothing about Syria in the international media. And it's unfortunate because, in essence, because of the nuclear deal, Iran has been able to develop a shield against any international pressure on Al-Qaeda, its missiles, attacks on the international community, its attack on shipping in the Arabian Ocean, its attack on shipping in the Gulf, its attack on energy facilities in Saudi Arabia, to include in the Red Sea, and of course its acts of terrorism. And finally, I would say that the U.S. response to an Iranian attempt to kidnap and carry away out of the country an opposition figure for one of the leading figures in the world for women's rights, the U.S. position was quite muted in response to that. And I think that sends a terrible message to Iran that because of the nuclear talks, it can get away with pretty much whatever it wishes, other than a press statement from a U.S. government spokesman.
Do you think there's a good likelihood that Al-Qaeda and others will return to full-scale terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia and in the West in the near future if this continues, if this policy by Western countries continues?
So one of the great success stories of the last decade has been the efforts to eradicate Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula outside of Yemen. Within Yemen, it remains a persistent force, but knock on wood, it's been many years since you've seen a major attack by Al-Qaeda elsewhere in the Gulf Cooperation Council. And that's a testimony to the exceptional work done by the security services in these countries and their partners in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. So I'm not so much concerned that you're going to see attacks in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Qatar or Kuwait directly. But here is what your viewers should be concerned about. Al-Qaeda, this is public information, was attempting to build a nuclear weapon. It wasn't the same thing as you see on an American missile or a Russian missile. It was a large, dirty bomb to employ against a city. Al-Qaeda was working to build a biological weapon. Again, not sophisticated, but effective in a simplistic way. If these operations were conducted by very small groups in very difficult to identify locations in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda could reconstitute this. It would be difficult for us to identify them because of our lack of intelligence footprint. And those actors coming out, working abroad to develop those capacities and to use them, perhaps in the Gulf, perhaps in Europe, perhaps in the United States or elsewhere, would be a terrible act. And this is when people ask me what I worry about regarding Al-Qaeda, it is that Iran will facilitate this through its release of Saif al-Adil, who ran these programs when he was running an element of Al-Qaeda, or through the facilitation cell that Al-Qaeda maintains to this day in Iran.
That was actually my next question. Whether it's possible that rather than relying on these rudimentary dirty bombs and so forth, Al-Qaeda could simply become yet another proxy or partner for Iran and benefit from more sophisticated technologies, more sophisticated methods of attack that Iran can provide them with. And apparently it's, anything is in the realm of possibilities if Iran decides it's advantageous enough in the near future.
That is correct. Generally, Iran works with Al-Qaeda by allowing it to do whatever it wants, and Al-Qaeda picks up its technology in other locations. But that is generally correct.
While that still remains to be seen what happened so far, Al-Qaeda has not materialized in some of these places because of the past effectiveness, but it doesn't mean that it won't if Iran's ideological proclivities continue to be disseminated, if the situation in those countries destabilizes thanks to other factors. But Iran in the meantime is trying to do as much damage as it can through its cyber attacks. We've seen a lot of recent reports on its cyber warfare attacks on Israel. We've seen some political meddling related to the United States. What exactly what goals is Iran pursuing with that, and what means does it have at its disposal? And we've seen a lot about Iran, a recent article about Iran coercing private hackers into working for its agenda. How likely is it to employ, for instance, Russian hackers or Chinese and North Korean hackers, not just its own hackers who may be more sophisticated than its own citizens at delivering these blows?
That's a very good question. So let me step back and say that although China, Russia, and North Korea often receive more media attention because of the nature of their cyber operations against the United States and the scale of those operations, there is no question that in the history of the internet, and I'm being very careful with my language, Iran's offensive cyber operations have been the most wide-ranging, consequential, and costly. Iran conducted the first cyber offensive action against the United States, against an American casino. Iran conducted an offensive operation against the Dutch firm DigiNotar, which compromised the internet's security certificate system. Iran has attacked multiple countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council area, regarding Israel, in Europe, parliaments in Canada, in London. It's attacked multiple actors. They've attacked me on a number of occasions. So Iran's actions are wide-ranging and robust. generally run by their intelligence services and their ministries, often conducted in the name of proxies using a false flag approach, taking the name of the proxies as a cover. But Iran already uses Russian hacker capacity, drawing upon dark web hackers for hire. In essence, a way that Iran sometimes works if it needs a tool is simply to announce on the dark web it wishes to attack someone in exchange for so much Bitcoin. Somebody does some action, it then pays that Bitcoin. Iran has stolen several $billion worth of intellectual property from the United States and Europe, from hundreds of universities. So Iran's threat as a cyber actor is significant. It's just not as wide-ranging or conducted on the same scale in political terms as, say, Russia. But it is conducted in against similar targets. And we even saw in the last election information operations conducted by Iranian cyber operators.
There's been a lot of talk about the vulnerability of the electric grid, and there's been a discussion whether a cyber attack or physical attack on poorly guarded facilities is more likely. And so far, there hasn't been any concrete conclusion, but we've seen the vulnerability of these infrastructures due to Russian actors in the past. Why hasn't Iran taken a direct hit to some of these vulnerabilities?
So, according to public information, reported Iranian actors undertook an operation such as that against a dam in New York State. It would be foolish to think that Iran has not undertaken similar efforts against other aspects of America's infrastructure and the infrastructure of our partners in the Middle East and in Europe.
So we can safely say that Iran presents a direct security threat to the United States and in its interest, not just to its partners, not just to its interest abroad, but domestic security interest. I think that would be a fair assessment based on what you just said.
Well, that is correct. And I think if there's one soundbite I'd like to leave with your viewers, it is that of all of the targets or the problems the United States faces in the world, Iran remains the only challenge that is simultaneously strategic, lethal, and urgent. So China is a strategic target and an urgent one, but we don't expect China to kill Americans tomorrow with missile attacks. We do from Iran. We think Al-Qaeda is an urgent and lethal problem, but it's not strategic. They're not going to go against the U.S. economy by turning off oil and trade through the Bab el-Mandab or the Strait of Hormuz. Even with Russia, we don't see them like China as a country that wants to kill Americans as you and I are speaking. So Iran is unique in this capacity. It is capable of strategic, lethal, and urgent threats against the United States. And it is for this reason that policymakers, Democrats and Republicans, have made Iran a priority since 1979, because they've got no choice but to respond to such a threat to American lives and interests.
To end this fascinating conversation with a final question, what surprises, wildcards, and unexpected developments should the analyst be on guard for? I do realize that you can't expect the unexpected 100%. That's why it's the unexpected. But to some extent, what do you think are the things that are not being taken into consideration at the moment but should?
I think there are two that I would point out. The first is, off the coast of Yemen is a large oil tanker. It is stranded, it is damaged, it is known as the Safar. It has 4 times the amount of oil of the Exxon Valdez. It has begun to leak. At any moment, it could explode or collapse. If it did so, it would destroy the fishing grounds permanently, or at least for decades, for 2 million Yemenis. It would destroy the economies of 8 million people in the region. it would shut down the Bab el Mandab because ships can't move through that kind of oil. The Houthis have denied international efforts to repair this. They've claimed the Americans and the British technicians are spies. They have asked that the oil be sold and handed to them. They've asked the ship be repaired completely and turned over to them. The demands are outrageous. The United Nations is stuck. If this ship explodes, and this could happen while we're speaking, God forbid, it would be the most significant environmental disaster in history, period. The second issue, and this is shorter, is every day it seems Iran is firing a missile or drone against civilian targets in Saudi Arabia. Many of these targets have dozens of foreigners as well as Saudi men, women, and children. If a significant civilian casualty event occurs, the Saudis would not unreasonably believe enough is enough and they have to take the fight to Iran. This could transform the region to a new level of tension, of violence, and perhaps bring about the regional conflict that we all wish to avoid. Each of these disasters is preventable if Iran will tell the Houthis to allow the West to fix this ship or to take the oil away. If the Houthis cooperate, we prevent this disaster. If Iran stops sending its ballistic missiles and armed drones, it will not kill civilians. But these are Iranian choices. They aren't our choices.
Ironically, Iran continues these activities even as it claims to be negotiating directly with Saudi Arabia and claiming some level of success. No doubt exaggerated. And as for the environmental disaster, it seems to be a form of blackmail, but I'm not entirely sure how. It's almost cutting off your nose to spite your face at this point. So not really sure what Iran is getting out of it by not doing anything with it.
Well, you're correct. The talks between the Gulf states have not been terrifically productive, but it demonstrates again that regional actors, as well as the United States and Europe, are willing to try diplomacy with Iran. There is this myth that diplomacy is never tried with Iran, it's only pressure. But the reality is that diplomacy without a coercive tool behind it is unlikely to succeed significantly. And regarding the Safar, the ship that is capable of such a disaster, it remains one more threat over the West as to why the Houthis should be accommodated by the international community. As long as that ship is a danger, it's another reason that the Houthis can claim they must be treated better than they deserve by the international community politically.
Actually, I would almost say it's an argument in the opposite direction. Anyone who allows an impending disaster to take place should not be anywhere near any amount of power, as they're exercising extremely poor judgment and endangering the entire region. But that's just me. Thank you so much for your insightful comments and for very interesting new way of thinking that I think I really hope more people will pick up on after watching this program. And thank you for addressing this diversity of issues related to Iran that hopefully will be taken more seriously. And I hope to see more engaged, innovative thinking in the analysis I see as a result of these conversations, because hearing the same talking points from one side to the other is not particularly comforting when such a serious issue is on the table. This was the Washington Outsider Report.
Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you and your viewers a healthy, peaceful, and prosperous year to come.
Thank you, and very much the same to you. And I hope we'll be talking more in the coming year, hopefully about better developments than what we are observing today. This was the Washington Outsider Report. This was our final event for the year, but we'll be returning in 2022 with more great programming, great guests, and in-depth conversations, taking our audiences beyond the headlines and into the depths of the situations that may be overlooked by the mainstream media or simply not discussed in enough detail to give any real understanding. With you I was Irina Tsukerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, and our guest today was Mr. Norman Roule. Thank you very much. Happy New Year to everyone, and hopefully it will be a healthy and a peaceful one.